Gaining true freedom through forgiveness. I'd like to share a story with you. This is about Harry Houdini. Most everybody knows who that was, master magician. And one day, Harry came up with a stunt that he knew was going to be fantastic. He told everybody in the world that he could break out of any prison in the world, any jail in the world, by just walking in with his everyday suit. And there was a prison, I forget exactly where this was, but they took him up on his offer. And he had to travel to this prison. And he walked into the jail with his suit on, and they opened up the door to put him in the cell, and they closed it. And he waited until after all the jailers were gone, and then he took off his belt. And in the video that I saw, you're wondering, well, what is Harry doing here, okay? But he took off his belt, and inside that belt, hidden inside that belt, was a piece of wire. It was about this long. It was some kind of cable, because it was round, but it was very flexible. And after making sure no one was around, he went to work on that lock. And he poked that thing in the lock on that cell door, and he wiggled it around. He was just confident that things were going to loosen up after a little bit. But after a little bit, nothing happened. He told the people that he would be out of there in an hour. A half hour was approaching, and the sweat was beginning to pour down on his face as he's wiggling and wobbling this thing in the lock. And when the hour approached, he about fainted, okay? Because he was no closer to getting out than when he first came in. And he began working again, and all of a sudden, he just couldn't handle the stress of it anymore. By now, he's just pouring with sweat, okay? And this has never happened to him before. And he falls out on the floor. He actually falls out, and he hits the prison cell door, and it swings open. He gets up from the floor, and he goes over to take a look at the lock mechanism, and he opens it, and he's checking. And the only thing he can think of is that prison cell door was never locked to begin with. Of course, the story here is that how many doors are locked in us? How many prisons do we lock ourselves in because we refuse to forgive ourselves or someone else? The prison in Houdini's case was in his mind because he believed that door was locked and he could not get out. So too, when we are reeling from being hurt by someone or feeling like we have been wronged by someone in some way, we too can lock ourselves in a prison that is of our own making. I think, in fact, one of the most difficult prisons of the mind is this one that has to do with unforgiveness. But we're not thinking and we're not aware that we choose which path we're going to take. The graphic that you see in your program is from the book by Desmond Tutu and his daughter Moko Tutu. It's from the Book of Forgiving, the fourfold path for healing ourselves and our world. And inside that little graph, I have in red the title of the book, just in case you might like to get one. This one is the Salina Public Library's copy, so after looking through this, I went ahead and sent for my own copy of the book. It is an excellent, excellent tool. When we have been hurt or wronged by someone, it is not always just, it's not easy. People say, oh, forgive it and forget, okay? But you know, forgive and forget is not in the Bible. Nowhere. Jesus did talk about forgiveness. The most famous one is Matthew 18, verse 21 through 22, where Peter, who thinking that, you know, he's on top of everything, and he's a good disciple, he knows his stuff, says to Jesus, how many times should I forgive my neighbor if he sins against me? 7 times? And he is, I'm sure, about shocked when Jesus says, no, not 7 times, 70 times 7. Now, this is in the day and age without calculators, without computers. And I think that for some reason, 70 times 7 seemed like an enormous number of times to be forgiving someone. And that was Jesus' point, that forgiveness can always be given. And it doesn't matter whether we have experienced just a small slight or something earth-shattering. There are a lot of stories of people who have experienced misfortune, who have lost loved ones, in error, accidents, and also through random acts of violence. And there is a story about a couple, Wayne and Lynn Wagner. And they were riding somewhere, driving somewhere, and I don't recall where, but their 2 daughters were in the back seat and they were in front. Everyone was seat belted, as they should be. And all of a sudden, a car careened out from nowhere and rammed right into them. Their car went over the embankment and then hit a tree. And the next thing, Lynn and her husband knew, they were in the hospital. And a friend came to visit and said, "I'm sorry for your loss." And he said, "What do you mean, what loss?" And they had to tell them that their 2 daughters were lost in the accident. And the woman was driving drunk. Her name is Lisa. And she spared the couple a court case by admitting her guilt, and she was sent to prison. And she had actually been given 7 years, but she came out in 5. And this couple said that for all those years, she just seemed to be this name, okay? And it's kind of funny because they didn't hate her. They were so hurt that they were past hate. They were past anger. They had to surrender this, give it up, because it was eating them alive. There was nothing that they could have done. There was nothing that they did wrong. The parole board sent them a notice saying that Lisa was going to be coming out from prison. And they called the prison and set up a time when they can meet with Lisa. And the prison officer said, "This is a very unusual thing, okay, but we're going to allow it." Lisa consented to have this couple visit. And when they came, they sat around a large table, and they began to visit and talk about things. But actually, before this, I'm going to step back. Lynn says that the minute they walked in this room and she took a look at Lisa, the 2 of them hugged, and they were crying for a long time, and they would not let go of each other. She said that, strangely enough, that hugging Lisa and that crying felt like a ton of weight had been lifted off of her. And so they sat down, and then they began talking, and Lisa began sharing about what she was doing in prison. She began sharing about the AA program that she was in. As many of you may know, the 6th step is when you confess, basically. You tell everything that you've done wrong in detail. And the 9th step is when you make amends for those faults, to the people that you've hurt. And Lisa said that she wanted to make amends somehow. She said she woke up every morning in prison, and she thought about those 2 girls, Mandy and Carrie, and there was absolutely nothing that she could do to change that. If she would have gone back to that situation and would have never been driving drunk. And she said she would have to live with that the rest of her life, but she wanted to do something to make amends. And she wanted to go forward and tell her story. And so she and Lynn actually became a pair, good friends, and they began speaking at churches, at different organizations, in high schools, and also universities, sharing about the tragedy and also the love, compassion, and forgiveness that is possible even in the midst of the most trying and painful situations. So what they realized is that forgiveness is a choice. There's been a lot of research that talks about the benefits of forgiveness and also what can happen when we choose unforgiveness. So not only are philosophers and theologians jumping in on this, and they've always been talking about forgiveness, but the medical doctors and psychologists and neurosurgeons are now looking into what happens in the brain when we forgive and what happens when we choose unforgiveness. Research shows that forgiveness actually transforms people mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, as well as physically. They're thinking a biology of forgiveness. And there is some kind of barrier in the brain that they are researching, which they feel either aids in a person being able to forgive or hinders that person from being able to forgive. Forgiveness training has been shown to reduce anger, depression, to increase our hopefulness, our spiritual connection, and give us a sense of confidence, emotional confidence. So understanding and being able to accept and express forgiveness is an important factor, not only in our state of mind, but also in our physical longevity. When we are uncaring, we lack compassion, we're unforgiving, we're going to pay the price for that somewhere, some way down the line, because we are putting out negative energy, which attracts negative experiences. Ultimately, forgiveness is the choice we make, and the ability to forgive others and ourselves comes from knowing that we are all in what a philosopher called it the human condition, that we are all humanly flawed. Yes, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin said, we are not humans. We are spiritual beings having a human experience. But that human experience can give us a lot of difficulty, a lot of trouble. It is often very challenging to have that human experience. But it doesn't have to be so when we realize that we have choices to make, that we can choose the path or the cycle of forgiveness rather than the cycle of revenge. Desmond Tutu gives a lot of stories in here about people who have chosen forgiveness and some who have not chosen forgiveness and felt that they couldn't do that. Well, I was at a lecture in Salina at the Episcopal Church, and the minister there actually knew Desmond Tutu. And his topic was how to forgive the unforgivable. But it kind of startled me when he said, one of the guys up front was talking about a situation where he was challenged and he chose to forgive that person for having caused him pain. And this priest said, only God can forgive. And I kind of felt sorry for this guy because he was talking about how he was working on forgiveness, and then the priest said, only God can forgive. He said, the most that you can do is just be willing to let that work through you. But you're not the one forgiving. And I thought, that's not quite my belief. And I had to stifle myself, okay? Because here in Unity, we understand, yes, I can accept this idea that only God can forgive. But Jesus told us where this God is. In Luke 17:21, he says that the kingdom of God, meaning where God lives, is within you. As Jesus said to the Pharisees, and that was one of the things that they really were put out about Jesus, is because he was taking God's power and he was forgiving sins, because they did not believe that people could be the avenue through which forgiveness could be shared. And so we have this same opportunity that God presence in us does empower us to be able to forgive. Although there are a lot of different things that we can do, steps and processes that we can use. I'd like to share from an article called Let It Go, 11 Ways to Forgive. And this article was written by a clinical psychologist, Alicia Goldstein, in April of 2017. It was in the Mindful magazine. And I'm not going to share all 11 of them. I'm only going to share a few of these ways to forgive. It says, number one, we have to understand what forgiveness is. We often think, improperly, that forgiveness is letting somebody off the hook. We often think that forgiving someone means the same thing as saying, oh, it's nothing, you know, it didn't really hurt, when it really hurt us, whatever it was, that loss, that experience of being, of injuring our dignity. And so we think that forgiveness is making ourselves less than. We think that forgiveness means that we are just letting that pain, just kind of covering that over. But it really, really isn't. Forgiveness is our decision, our conscious choice to release ourselves from the burden of pain and stress that holding on to resentment causes us to have. Number two, feel the pain. Hurts can run deep. And even when they don't seem to matter much of the time, it could be a slight thing, okay? And then later on, for some reason, that hurt gets triggered, although it was a small thing at the beginning. Something triggered it. Something else triggers it, okay? Now we're in full-blown pain. Experiences that happen to us can be, or trauma that happens to us, can begin to rest in us and reside in the memory, which is the subconscious mind. And later, when it's triggered, we're like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that that's what I was feeling. So, Dr. Goldstein says that it's important to feel our pain. What he says is that we should sit down, close our eyes, breathe, and try and get in touch with where that pain lodges in our body. Because we are all whole. Mind, body, all of this is together. Okay? What affects our mind affects our body. What affects our body affects our state of mind. So it's important that we give ourselves permission to feel what we feel, to acknowledge and to honor the pain that's very real to us. We may need to be supported. We may need to reach out. We may need to do something kind for ourselves. And this way, we can let this pain tell us when we are ready to let it go. Number three, he says, name it. Whether we've hurt ourselves or we've been hurt by someone else, we need to be honest and simply name how we feel about that situation. Because there is something about naming something that takes the power that we may have given it back. I was just thinking about what Trish and I were discussing earlier about Indians, and if I am correct, when they name babies, the name represents a characteristic or a property that they see in that child or are looking for to see in that child as they grow. And so naming something is a powerful thing. The study at UCLA says that when we name an emotional experience, it turns the volume down in our brain. And it allows us to move that thought into the prefrontal brain, where we have our rational thinking. So by naming our feelings, we can create more space between us and whatever was hurting us and not get overwhelmed. And number four, Dr. Goldstein says, let it out. Now, be careful with that, okay? Because I am certain he doesn't mean just let it out, okay? But what he's saying is share with another person. Share with a friend, someone who cares about us, so that we move this energy that is holding us in, so that we open that door up and move some of that negative energy out and become free from it. Keeping hurt feelings bottled up only causes additional stress to our mind and body. He says we can also write a letter. If there's no one that we feel comfortable speaking with about our pain, we can write a letter to this pain. We can write a letter to whoever we feel has hurt us or harmed us or wronged us in some way. A letter that we do not send, we can burn it. And we also have the burning bowl process here in Unity that is a great tool for when we need to release negative energy, painful energy. Now, that doesn't mean that there's nothing else we need to do. Forgiveness is a process, and just by one burning, it isn't done. We're not done. Okay? Depending on what the situation is that we have experienced, sometimes it takes more time in prayer and contemplation. Okay? Remember that Jesus, speaking at the Christ, said, "Come to me, all you who are labor, and I will give you rest." And that's not just a physical rest, it's a psychological, spiritual rest when we have been struggling with something. Take a break from it. Number 5, flip your focus. If we can flip our focus from being the victim and kind of turn that perspective around, okay, we might be able to see from that other person's shoes. We might be able to have some understanding of what caused them to say that hurtful thing or to do that hurtful thing. What caused that woman to drive drunk, knowing full well that she could kill herself or someone else? What causes people to commit crime, to be violent? What is going on, or what has been going on in their life to bring them to that point? We do know that people who hurt are people who are hurting for whatever is going on. And this helps us remember that we are one in our humanity. Who knows, if we were put in the same situation that person was, brought up in the same situation, experiences that person had, maybe we would lash out. It's a story with bullies, okay, who bully children in school. They are hurting. There was a doctor, and his son worked in a pizza part-time. He was going to college, and he was sent out to deliver a pizza to an apartment building. And when he got there, he rang the bell, and no one responded, and he went knocking on the doors, and no one had ordered pizza, so, it was a curious thing. But he was headed back to his truck to go back to the pizza shop and return it when a gang came upon him. And it seemed like it was an initiation for one of the 14-year-olds that was in the gang. There was an 18-year-old who was leading this gang. And the story is that the 18-year-old spoke to one of the 14-year-olds and said, "Bones, I want you to get him," and handed the 14-year-old a loaded gun. And his son tried to back away, but he was shot. And the coroner said that was a perfect shot. It went clear through underneath his arm, all the way through his chest and out the other armpit, injuring most every organ in his son's body. And when he found out about this, he didn't know how to feel. In fact, he didn't feel anything. He was numb. This was his only son, and he could never have imagined such a thing happening to his son, who had many times gone to that same neighborhood to deliver pizzas. He took it upon himself to find out all that he could about gangs and teenagers and what was going on in their mind. What is it that led teenagers to join violent gangs and to commit crimes like this? And he studied this and became very knowledgeable. He formed a foundation in his son's name, and he found funding, and he began going on the circuit. He began doing lectures and touring to share that on the other side of the gun, there are two hurt people. Both people are injured and in need of compassion and healing. And this was an organization that helped, the article said, over 500,000 kids, teenagers, to date. And the article was written in 2017. But he found a way to turn that energy into something that was helpful to others. He actually contacted the boy who, at 14, he was going to be getting out when he was 46. His term was 30 years. And he told that young man, when you get out, I'll have a job for you in my organization. And that motivated this young man to begin studies in jail when he was there. He got his GED and decided to change his life around. This man had given him hope, had forgiven him, had seen something good and positive in him. And that was probably what he was looking for when he joined that gang. So there are ways we can turn things around when we have been injured or been harmed or wronged in some way. Granting forgiveness. Now, in your program, that chart, the one on the left, Desmond Tutu calls the revenge cycle. And if you look at that from the top, as we go down, there's a box which has harm, hurt, and loss in it. And the arrow underneath that leads to pain. And right there at the juncture where this pain is experienced, there is a point of change. In the revenge cycle, we move on into choosing harm, a reaction to what was done to us. And on the right-hand side, we move from that pain to choosing to heal instead. And when we choose to heal, we begin an entire process, which he calls the fourfold path of forgiveness. Now, I got this book on Friday, and there was way too much for me to share with you today. But it's an excellent book, and I may consider doing some classes on this. It's powerful. Now, something interesting about this book. At the end of each chapter, there is a meditation. There is some journaling questions, and there is also a stone ritual. The two things that Desmond Tutu says you need in order to work with this book are a journal, a private journal, and also a stone. Go out and find a stone that appeals to you. He said, don't make it a boulder and don't make it a pebble. It's got to have some weight for you to put in your palm of your hand. And when we move into our meditation, I'm going to share with you one of the exercises of the stone ritual that's in this book. Now, the fourfold path has to do with telling the story. Get it out. It isn't about blaming or shaming. It's telling the story. Some people do this in support groups or with a counselor or writing it out. Number two, naming the hurt. And that's the same thing that Dr. Goldstein was talking about. When we name it, we take the power we've given it away. And then granting forgiveness. Recognizing that we all could be in the same boat. That there are two people on either end of a gun who are hurting. And then renewing or releasing the relationship. We can come up with a new story, just like the man who created that foundation and forgave the boy and offered him a job. Just like Lisa, who decided that she couldn't just live every day remembering that she had killed those two girls. She needed to do something to make amends for that. Now, we don't have to go out and change the world, okay, when we've been hurt. But these are examples that tell us that we can change the nature of this energy into something positive and something healing in whatever way we want to do that. And so, I invite you now to prepare for meditation. And I will share from the Book of Forgiving. You might like to close your eyes and follow your breath for a couple of moments. This exercise is called Opening to the Light.